Welcome back to Information Systems and Cybersecurity 375. Today we're going to take a step back from the computer, and instead of talking about how to make a web page, we're going to talk about what to make. We're going to talk about principles of design, what should be on a website, what it should look like, how it should behave, and we're going to think about some of the big picture issues. But first, a little disclaimer. Site design is a very complex issue. There's a lot to it. And I'm not an expert in design. In fact, I'm a technical guy, a computer scientist. My specialty is algorithms and programming. Site design is more in the purview of an artist or a graphic designer. So the little disclaimer here is, take everything I say with a grain of salt. This isn't my field, but I do think I have something to offer you. There's some certain basic principles of design that you should know and that you should follow as you're designing websites for this course and also when you go out into industry. So let's start with some visual design concepts. The first is the idea of balance. And in order to understand balance, we first have to understand a different idea, the idea of visual weight. So what is visual weight? Elements on a website or in any other piece of artwork or visual object, they have different visual weights that are determined by their properties. For example, the size of an object has a big influence on whether it attracts the eye. Larger elements tend to attract the eye more than smaller elements. Brightly colored objects tend to attract the eye more than faint objects or dimly colored objects. The eye is also attracted by certain shapes and textures, and so we have to pay attention to this when we design a website. A good website with a good visual design should try to distribute the weight evenly around the page. We shouldn't have lots of high weight objects on one side and very few on the other. Now, there's different ways to accomplish this. The easiest is what's called symmetric balance. Symmetric balance means that not only do we try to balance the page, but we do it in a particular way. We have elements that have the same weight in all the regions of the page. So for example, if I have a large graphic on the left, I should balance it with a large graphic on the right side of the page. That's symmetric balance. But symmetric balance isn't the only way to achieve balance on a website. Another approach is asymmetric balance. The idea behind asymmetric balance is that sometimes I can balance a large graphic with many small graphics. Or perhaps I can balance a brightly colored graphic with several faintly colored graphics. A third type of balance is called radial balance. And this is a different approach entirely. With radial balance, we pick a central point on the page and we distribute the elements around it evenly in sort of a circular pattern so that the display moves out from the center of the page toward the edges of the document. Another principle of design is called movement. Movement involves the path that the eye follows when you look at a site or a graphic. And psychologists and artists have studied visual movement extensively, and they found that the eye tends to follow certain rules. In particular, it follows lines. If you draw a line in a painting, or if you have a horizontal rule on your web page, the eye tends to follow that line. The eye is drawn to that line. It also tends to follow lines of text. So when you have paragraphs on your page, the eye will naturally start at the left and move toward the right, and from top to bottom. The eye also moves from large objects to smaller objects, from dark objects to light objects, from brightly colored objects to black and white objects. And the design principle that you should use here is that movement should be logical and smooth. For example, if you have hierarchical information, perhaps it's an outline of a paper or some other document. The most important points should have high visual weight. They should be large, they should be bold, they should be dark. And the subpoints should be smaller and lighter and have less bright colors. So the principle is that movement should be logical and smooth. Repetition is more of a tool for achieving some of these goals than it is a principle in and of itself. Websites should have a variety of different kinds of content and different presentation elements. but you should also have consistency. And repetition allows you to ensure consistency between a page. What do I mean by that? I mean that if you have a navigation bar at the top of every page, that's much nicer than having a navigation bar at the top of some pages and at the side of other pages. Users expect consistency, and if you don't repeat the same visual elements in the same way, you're going to confuse the user. So elements that correspond on the same page should use the same placement, colors, and fonts. Elements that correspond on different pages should use the same placement, colors, and fonts. Emphasis is another principle of design. Emphasis is the part of the design that catches the user's attention. And you should use emphasis to focus attention on the important parts of the page. Really, this principle is more about what not to do. And what you shouldn't do is have lots of distracting elements that take away from the purpose of the website. So for example, having cutesy animations at the bottom of a page distracts the user from the content. Having other visual artifacts, large images that are out of place and not related to the purpose of the website, like a huge logo, that's something to avoid in designing a website. Contrast is another principle of design. Contrast refers to a difference in appearance of different parts of the page. The eye is naturally drawn to the intersection of contrasting elements. So if I have something really large and bold over here and something that's not so large and not so bold over here, the eye is going to go where those two elements meet. So contrast is a tool that you can use that makes a page more interesting and can also be used to create emphasis, to focus the user on the important parts of the page. A good example of the use of contrast is highlighting the current page in your navigation bar. Unity. Unity is a feeling of harmony between the parts of the page. Now that's subjective. It talks about a feeling. That's not at all a technical topic. And I am not qualified to talk about feelings and subjective things. But I will say this, that a website should feel like one consistent experience. It shouldn't feel like a collection of random pages and elements. So try to have a unified, harmonious feel to your website. Don't do things like putting green text on red backgrounds, because clashing colors don't feel harmonious. Alignment is a tool that can enhance unity. Alignment is how sections of the website line up in space, and the principle that you should apply is that elements that are next to each other on the page should be properly aligned both horizontally and vertically. And finally, accessibility. Accessibility is an important design principle, in fact, one of the most important design principles. Accessibility means that the website is easy to navigate even for users who have disabilities or who are using legacy browsers or mobile devices. In fact, accessibility is so important that federal law, Section 508, actually requires government websites to make information accessible to those with disabilities. Just to see how important this is, Section 508 was part of the Rehabilitation Act of 1973. Now that's 20 years before the web existed. They were already thinking about making electronic documents accessible. When the web came along, they amended Section 508 to accommodate the web. And what Section 508 says now is that websites, government websites, need to follow Web Content Accessibility Guidelines. That's sometimes abbreviated WCA2 version 2.0. There's a link to that standard here, but I want to talk a little bit about what's in that standard. What does it mean to make a site accessible? How can we do that? So first of all, whenever you have non-text content, like an image or a video, or perhaps an audio clip, you should provide a text alternative. The reason for this is that visually handicapped users often can't see images or movies, and users with other handicaps may not be able to hear the audio. So if you provide a text alternative, then even though they can't see it to read it, they have a device called a screen reader that can read it to them. And so that makes it accessible to them. Audio and video content should provide captions or sign language for the hearing impaired, and a text transcript or a narration for the visually impaired. If your web page includes headings, lists, and tables, it's really important that visually handicapped users in particular can tell not just what they say, but how they relate to the other elements on the page. So you should annotate them properly so that they can be converted to audio in the appropriate sequence. Here's an important one. Color shouldn't be used to convey content. Why? Because about a third of all of your users are colorblind. And if you use color to distinguish between elements on a page or to convey information, those users are going to miss out on that content. Instead, use textures, size, other graphic indicators to distinguish between elements. When you do use color, document colors should provide adequate contrast so that they can actually be seen without straining the eye. Text should be resizable so that users who need large print can zoom in on your page and not lose information. Don't include images of text on your page. Just put the text itself directly in the page because screen readers can't handle images, but they can read the text. When you contain movies or audio content, your page should provide audio controls so that the user can pause or stop the content and also adjust the volume. Avoid distractions like background audio that can make it hard when someone's using a screen reader that reads links to the user. If they can't hear that because of your background audio, your page is not accessible. I realize this is a lot of rules to go over, but we're almost done. Here's another really important one. Everything on the site that requires user input, form controls, buttons, navigation links, user interface components, should be accessible via the keyboard. I did not understand how important this was until I taught a computer class that had a 78-year-old woman and her 82-year-old husband in it. They weren't visually handicapped, but they had arthritis. And I learned something very important from that class, and that's that a mouse is very difficult to use with arthritis, but a keyboard is very easy to use. If they needed to use the mouse for something, it would take them a very long time, but as long as they could find a keyboard shortcut, they were able to keep up with the rest of the class. So it's really important that you provide keyboard access to all of the elements of your page. If you have something that's time sensitive, perhaps you have some sort of online quiz, or maybe you have a login timer, make sure that you give users enough time to actually read the page before it times out. Keep in mind that some users may read slower than others. Here's an obvious one. Avoid content that can cause seizures. This is obvious too. Content should be well organized and labeled clearly. You should do that just for your ordinary users, but also for users with disabilities. Keep in mind that some of your users may use languages other than English, and they may come from different cultures than you. Cultural differences can cause all sorts of problems and confusion if you don't design for them. When you design your navigation system, make sure that your navigation and content is predictable and intuitive. A good example of that is that users expect a back button to be on the left and a forward button to be on the right. If you switch them and put your back button on the right and your forward button on the left, you will confuse your users. So don't do things like that. Make your navigation system intuitive. Provide the users with assistance in avoiding mistakes. Do things like input validation. If you expect them to type in a date, have some sort of control that checks whether they're typing in a valid date and warn them if they're not providing correct input. And also, think about the future. Don't just make sure content is compatible with current tools, but also with future tools, web browsers that haven't even been designed yet. And the best way to do that is by following standards. If you follow the HTML5 and the CSS3 standards, you're going to future-proof most of your sites against changes down the road. So you may have noticed that in talking about accessibility, a topic that came up again and again is navigation. Navigation is really important. It's one of the most important aspects of site design. And we saw already when we talked about HTML that HTML5 provides a new element, the nav element, that lets you specify that a section or a list contains navigation elements. The overall goal of a good site navigation system should be to allow users to navigate through the site easily. And there's three ways that we do that. The first is that we make sure that when we have navigation elements on multiple pages, that we give them consistent appearance and placement. That helps the user find them and build a mental model of where they are in the site. When you allow keyboard navigation of your navigation bar, you should make sure that keyboard focus moves through those elements in a logical manner. This is also important for form elements. If you're expecting the user to type in input into a form, make sure that when they hit tab, it doesn't jump randomly around the page, but it goes in a logical order from left to right, top to bottom. And also, as I mentioned before, it's really important to provide keyboard shortcuts for users who have difficulty using a mouse. It's also a lot more efficient to use the keyboard than to try to click on things with a mouse. Another thing to keep in mind is that accessibility applies not just to users with disabilities, but to users with legacy clients. And yes, there are still people using Internet Explorer 6, and yes, they are a market that you can't afford to ignore. Legacy browsers pose a lot of unique problems. They don't support a lot of the modern standards like HTML5 and CSS3. They're missing all sorts of features, especially JavaScript features like the HTML canvas and modern multimedia tags. This is especially true of Internet Explorer versions 6, 7, 8, and 9. And pages created for one browser can be rendered very differently in other browsers because of those missing features or because of differences in the implementation of the features that they do have. Again, Internet Explorer is egregious in this. It often will implement something that other browsers implement, but in a very different way. And so if you're writing your website for Chrome and Firefox, you can do it following the standard, but then to make it work in Internet Explorer, you have to add some extra code that checks if you're using Internet Explorer and does things in a different way. That's kind of annoying, but it's important to do because if you don't, you're basically making your site inaccessible to a fairly significant market. And that means that your business will lose money because you will lose those customers. I will say that there's a modern approach to dealing with this, and that's to use something called a polyfill. A polyfill is basically some JavaScript code that you can load into your browser that allows you to pretend it's a modern browser, whether it's not. So you load this on your website. It checks what browser the user is employing. And if they're using a modern browser, it'll use HTML5 and CSS3 just like normal. But if they're using a legacy browser, it'll basically simulate those features using old features, which is a really neat thing. It does mean that your website will take a little bit longer to load because you have to have all this extra JavaScript in it. But the trade-off is usually worth it. We'll talk more about how this works when we get to advanced CSS3 and we talk about media queries. So if we're going to talk about site design, it's really important to talk about this word, this phrase, Web 2.0. What is Web 2.0? Well, really, there is no such thing as Web 2.0. It's just a marketing buzzword that was popularized by Tim O'Reilly. He actually didn't come up with it. Someone else did in 2003, but he really liked it, and so he made it really popular. And what it refers to is a shift in website design that took place in the early 2000s. And there were some really big differences between how we designed websites in the 90s and what we do today. And Web 2.0 is sort of a way of generally describing those. And so there's no one definition of what Web 2.0 means, but there are some general features of Web 2.0 sites that we can talk about. In general, Web 2.0 sites have a focus on dynamic content and dynamic pages rather than on static content. What does that mean? Well, a static page is a page that only changes when it's edited by the site manager. So in your adventure game, for example, you created a bunch of HTML pages. The user can't upload content to those pages. All the user can do is click on the links. If I actually wanted to change the page, I'd have to log into the server and pull up Vim and edit it or something like that. And so those are static pages. They don't change very often. A good example of the use of a static page is the About page on a website. Usually that doesn't change very often, and so it's just stored as an HTML file somewhere. On the other hand, dynamic pages allow the user to add content, to edit and delete content. and so they change frequently. Good examples of dynamic pages are blogs and social networking sites and shopping carts and games, and all of these started really becoming popular in the early 2000s. Before that, I think we had some shopping carts, but they were really rudimentary. They were basically implemented with static pages. It was a difficult thing to deal with. Dynamic pages require more support. They require different tools. With a static page, I can just write an HTML file, and the web browser takes care of everything. But with dynamic pages, I have to have maybe a special web server that can handle my content. I might need a database or some sort of file storage or file system. I probably need scripts both on the server side and maybe even some JavaScript in the client. So there's a lot more investment that takes place when we're creating dynamic pages. So what are some of the principles of Web 2.0? What are some of the general features? Well, in general, Web 2.0 websites involve information sharing. So instead of displaying static pages, they involve lots of interaction with the user. And so users can upload content like movies and pictures and blogs and hotel reviews. So for example, Flickr and YouTube and Yelp are examples of Web 2.0 sites. And of course, all the blogs out there. Another feature of Web 2.0 sites is interoperability. What this means is that one website can interact with another website. Web 2.0 sites usually provide something called an API, an application programming interface, that lets a software developer access the features of that site. So what that allows us to do is create what's called a mashup. We can take the APIs from several different sites, put them together, and make something new. So for example, I could write a web application that takes reviews from Yelp and takes maps from Google Maps and puts them together and plots restaurants with good reviews in my area on a Google map. That would be a mashup. Collaboration is another important feature of Web 2.0. Web 2.0 sites, because they allow more interaction between users, provide new opportunities for collaboration. So a good example of that is social media. Facebook and Twitter. Boy, I don't even want to mention MySpace anymore. It's been gone forever. But Snapchat, all of these sites allow users to interact with each other in ways that you couldn't do with static pages. Most of this collaborative software is enabled by something called AJAX, asynchronous JavaScript and XML, which we're going to get to later in the course. And finally, Web 2.0 sites tend to be developed using a method called user-centered design. Now, this is less a principle of design than it is a project management philosophy. And so let's take a moment to talk about some different alternatives for project management. When you design a website, you need to have some system for planning when you're going to reach the major milestones of the project. And traditional software development, I don't know, 30 years ago, looked a little bit like this. There was what we called the waterfall model. It typically took 3 to 6 months to deploy a project. It was a sequential workflow model. The idea was we started with requirements analysis. We asked users, what do you want in the website? And we did detailed interviews to figure out what they wanted. And we wrote those up in a requirements document that said the website will do this, and the website will do this, and the website will do this. And we thought not just about content, but about what it would look like, how it would be navigated, how it would be maintained, who would have access to it, who would be able to edit it. All of these things we would take into account. What hardware do we need? And that would go into a requirements document. And there'd be a certain amount of time set aside for requirements analysis, and then, once that time had elapsed, we would move on to the design phase of the project. And in the design phase, we wouldn't necessarily write any code, but typically what we would do is we would sit down and we would create some sort of prototype or some mock-up, some model of what the website would look like. Here are the different pages. Here's what will be on each one. Here's how we're going to style the logo. Here are the colors that we use. And we'd come up with all those documents, and we would show them to users and get feedback on them, and we would improve the design. And after a certain amount of time has passed, we would move on past the design phase to the implementation phase. And in the implementation phase, we would actually code the website. We would use the requirements documents and all the design documents to figure out what we were going to create, and we'd write code for it. And then we would show it to users and do some testing. And once we were done with the testing phase, then we would move to deployment and site maintenance. And sometimes at this point, the whole process would start over. We would start designing the second version of the website by going back to the board and doing more requirements analysis. We talk to users and say, what do you like about the old site? What don't you like about the old site? What do you want to see in the new site? And then move on to design and implementation all the way through this model. This is sometimes called the SDLC, or Systems Development Lifecycle. That's a term coined by Microsoft to describe this, but most people just call it the waterfall model. SDLC applies to several different models, but this was sort of the common one. So there's a lot of advantages to this approach. First of all, requirements analysis is really important. Before you sit down and create a website, you absolutely need to do a needs analysis to ask users what they want in your website. And so in the waterfall model, requirements analysis is done up front, and we dedicate a specific amount of time to it. And that can be a really good thing because it means we don't waste time later developing and implementing things that users don't actually even want. We also do design early in the waterfall model and on a fixed schedule, which again means that we're going to be more thoughtful in our design and we're more likely to have a good implementation. And so this can reduce the testing burden later on because we've taken our time to do a good design. However, the waterfall model had a lot of drawbacks. It was very rigid. It often would waste a lot of time on documentation. And about the time that the web became popular and Web 2.0 became a buzzword in the early 2000s, companies started moving away from the waterfall model toward other models. So we're going to talk about agile development models in a minute. I think you have some experience with those from your AP Principles class, or possibly from AP Java even. But a different alternative is called User-Centered Design, or UCD, and this is what's often associated with Web 2.0 projects. So it's a little bit like waterfall in that it has stages of development, stages of the project, but instead of being sequential where you move from one phase to another, it's iterative. So you do a phase, and then you move on to the next, and move on to the next, and then you go back to the beginning and start all over. And you do that over and over again until you reach your time limit. So there's no fixed amount of time you spend in each of these stages. The three stages are a needs analysis, or field study. Again, that's really important, where you conduct interviews and maybe do a market study to see what users, potential users might want. You might examine previous marketing projects to see what worked and what didn't. Or maybe you look at existing marketing campaigns and steal some of their ideas, like their logos and their slogans and things. And you also create usually several documents in this phase: a task list, who's going to do what in the design phase and the testing phase, and a content list. What content do we need in the website? And finally, you think about who are your users going to be? What kinds of users? Are you going to have an administrative user? Are you going to have normal users? Are users going to be in special categories? Maybe you have teachers and students in an e-learning project. You'll think about how to categorize your users, and you'll develop use case scenarios that say, okay, this kind of user might use the product in this way, and you'll tell a bunch of stories so that you can think about how to design a website to be used in those ways. Following the needs analysis phase, there's a design and prototyping phase where you create initial designs of the content navigation. Again, typically this isn't done with code. This is typically done with storyboards and pencil and paper and doing mock-ups where you create like an image file or a graphic that shows what the website will look like without it actually generating dynamic content. You might occasionally actually do some coding and create what's called a functional prototype, but that's typically at the end of the phase. Before that, you do a lot of pencil and paper work to try to get there. And the idea, again, is you're trying to involve users at each level of this. You're doing needs analysis first by interviewing users. As you do design and prototyping, you're interacting with users to get them to give you feedback on whether it's a good design. And finally, when you're done, you do testing. So you actually build the website, and as you build the website, you have users test it. Typically, you don't put the website up for production until you've already done lots of testing. You've done some design walkthroughs and let users see what it will look like. You've done some functional testing. And then once users have said, OK, yeah, this is what we want, then you put it up for people to use and go back to needs analysis to start over and see how you can improve it. A third approach is agile development. Agile development, like UCD, is an iterative model. Instead of moving from one stage strictly to another, we're going to repeat and repeat. Agile development moves implementation earlier, and it uses more code and less documentation than the other approaches. What this does is it allows the requirements to change throughout the development lifecycle. With Waterfall, we set the requirements early, but then they don't change through the rest of the development of the project. We kind of have this contract that says we're going to build a website like this, and that's what we come out with. And if the user says, oh, but that's not what I really meant, we say, tough, this is what we agreed to do. With Agile, if the user says, oh, but what I really wanted was a red button, you can change it to be a red button. And so it's much more responsive, and development happens much more quickly. There's different approaches to Agile development. Two of them are extreme programming and Scrum. Extreme programming usually means that you program with pairs. One person sitting at the keyboard typing and the other watching over their shoulder, making comments, and then sometimes you switch back and forth. You create frequent releases in a short period of time, and it focuses heavily on code review and unit testing. Scrum's a little bit different. It uses code sprints to manage progress on a project. You can use extreme programming with Scrum. Each sprint, I should say sprint, not spring, usually starts with a 15-minute daily Scrum meeting, where you talk about your progress and assign tasks for the rest of the sprint. It typically uses a Scrum board or sometimes a Kanban to track problems and feature development. So in summary, accessibility is an important consideration in site design. Web 2.0 is a term that you should know. It's a marketing term that involves information sharing, interoperability, collaboration, and user-centered design. User-centered design is only one of 3 important management techniques. There's also Waterfall, UCD, and Agile. I hope that you're doing well with your project. I'm looking forward to seeing them.